My name is Lorenzo Zalamea, and 3 months ago, I discovered that the family who threw me out like yesterday's garbage had no idea they'd just handed me the keys to an empire worth $80 million. But let me tell you how I went from sleeping in my beat-up Honda Civic to watching my own relatives beg for scraps from a fortune they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of burnt empanadas and cheap cologne filled the cramped living room of our family house in East Phoenix. It was my cousin Maria's quinceañera planning meeting, and somehow, like always, it had turned into another Lorenzo intervention session. I sat wedged between my Aunt Carmen and the armrest of our faded brown couch, watching my mother pace back and forth in front of the television, her hands moving as fast as her mouth. 28 years old, she said, not looking at me but speaking loud enough for the entire block to hear. 28, and what does he have to show for it? A part-time job at the hardware store and dreams that don't pay rent. My sister Isabella nodded from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, lipstick perfectly applied even though she'd just gotten off her shift at the bank. Mama's right, Lorenzo. We're tired of covering for you, tired of making excuses when people ask what you're doing with your life. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, that feeling like the room was getting smaller with every word. This wasn't new. These conversations happened every few months, usually triggered by some family event where everyone else had updates about promotions, new cars, or engagement rings, and I had nothing but the same old story about trying to figure things out. "I'm working on something," I said, keeping my voice level. "The photography business is starting to pick up. I booked 3 weddings next month." My uncle Roberto snorted from his chair by the window. "Photography? Lorenzo, that's a hobby, not a career. You think you're some kind of artist, but artists who don't make money are just expensive bums." The laugh that rippled through the room hit me harder than any punch could have. These were supposed to be my people, my blood, the ones who had my back when the world got tough. But sitting there, surrounded by their disappointed faces and sharp tongues, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. My mother stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. Her voice dropped to that dangerous whisper she used when she was past angry and moving into something colder. "Your father worked 2 jobs to keep this roof over our heads. I cleaned offices until my knees gave out to make sure you and your sister had what you needed. And this is how you repay us? By floating through life like some teenager who thinks the world owes him something?" "I never asked for any of that," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I never asked you to sacrifice anything for me." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Isabella pushed off from the doorway and walked over to stand next to our mother, forming a wall of judgment that felt impossible to climb. "That's the problem," Isabella said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You never asked for anything because you never had to. Everything was just handed to you, and now you think that's how life works? Well, guess what? It doesn't." I stood up, my hands shaking just enough that I shoved them into my pockets to hide it. "I'm trying to build something. I know it doesn't look like much right now, but what?" Uncle Roberto interrupted. "But we should keep believing in your potential while you drain resources from this family? While your mother worries herself sick about how she's going to pay for Maria's party because she spent her savings keeping you afloat?" That stopped me cold. I looked at my mother, searching her face for some sign that this wasn't true, but her expression told me everything I needed to know. The guilt hit me like a freight train, mixing with anger and embarrassment until I couldn't tell which emotion was stronger. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "Of course you didn't know," my mother replied, "because you don't pay attention to anything that doesn't revolve around you and your dreams." Aunt Carmen, who had been silent through most of this, finally spoke up from beside me. "Maybe it's time for some tough love, Lorenzo. Maybe what you need is to face the real world without a safety net." I turned to look at her, this woman who used to sneak me candy when I was a kid, who always took my side when I got in trouble at school. Her eyes were kind but firm, and I realized she wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to save me from something she thought was worse than pain. "What are you saying?" I asked, though part of me already knew. My mother sat down heavily on the coffee table, her face suddenly looking older than her 53 years. "We're saying it's time for you to find your own place, Lorenzo. Time for you to learn what it means to stand on your own 2 feet." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the room at all these faces I'd known my entire life, searching for even one person who might speak up for me, who might suggest that maybe this was too extreme. But all I saw was resignation, disappointment, and something that looked suspiciously like relief. "You're kicking me out," I said, not as a question, but as a statement that needed to be said out loud to feel real. "We're setting you free," Isabella corrected, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "You'll thank us for this someday." I laughed, short and bitter. "Free? You think putting me on the street is freedom?" Uncle Roberto said with a shrug, "You have friends, you have options. What you don't have is the luxury of treating this house like a hotel while the rest of us work our asses off." I wanted to fight back, wanted to list all the ways I'd contributed over the years, all the times I'd helped with repairs or watched my younger cousins or driven people to appointments when they needed it. But looking at their faces, I realized it wouldn't matter. They'd already made their decision. Maybe they'd made it a long time ago, and this was just the first time they'd worked up the courage to say it out loud. "How long do I have?" I asked. 2 weeks, my mother said, without hesitation, like she'd already thought this through. "That's enough time to figure something out." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. I walked toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, the room I'd lived in since I was 12 years old, the room that held everything I owned and most of my memories. Behind me, the conversation picked up again, voices talking about quinceañera decorations and budget adjustments, like they hadn't just fundamentally altered the course of my life. In my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the walls covered with photographs I'd taken over the years. Sunsets over South Mountain, street art in downtown Phoenix, candid shots of kids playing in Steel Indian School Park. They looked different now. Less like art and more like evidence of wasted time, proof that I'd been chasing something that didn't exist while real life happened around me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My phone buzzed. A text from my best friend Marcus. "Still on for beers tonight?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Can't make it. Something came up." That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling, the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood and older pipes. In 2 weeks, I wouldn't hear these sounds anymore. In 2 weeks, I'd be somewhere else, assuming I figured out where that somewhere else would be. Through the thin walls, I could hear my mother and Isabella talking in the kitchen, their voices low but not quite low enough. I caught fragments. "For his own good," and "should have done this years ago," and "maybe now he'll grow up." I pulled my pillow over my head, but their words followed me anyway, mixing with my own thoughts until I couldn't tell which voice was which. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was a burden, a dreamer who'd forgotten to wake up, a man-child who needed to be pushed out of the nest before he'd ever learned to fly. But lying there in the dark, surrounded by everything I was about to lose, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong about one thing. This wasn't going to make me stronger or more responsible or more grateful for what I had. This was going to hollow me out, carve away pieces of my heart that I'd never get back, and leave me wondering if the family I'd loved my entire life had ever really loved me at all. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my mother making breakfast, the same routine she'd followed for as long as I could remember. Coffee brewing, eggs sizzling, the radio playing softly in the background. For a moment, lying there with my eyes still closed, I could pretend that yesterday had been a bad dream, that nothing had changed. But when I walked into the kitchen, my mother didn't look up from the stove. She'd made eggs and toast for herself and Isabella, who was getting ready for work, but there was no third plate waiting for me. The message was clear. The transition had already begun. "Morning," I said, more to test the temperature of the room than because I expected a warm response. "Good morning," my mother replied without turning around. Isabella looked up from her phone long enough to nod in my direction, then went back to scrolling through whatever was capturing her attention. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the counter, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The silence stretched between us, filled with things none of us wanted to say. Finally, Isabella gathered her purse and keys and headed toward the door. "I'll be late tonight," she said to our mother, "going out with some friends from work." After she left, the kitchen felt even more uncomfortable. My mother finished her breakfast, rinsed her plate in the sink, and started gathering her things for her own job at the medical clinic where she worked as a receptionist. "Lorenzo," she said as she reached for her purse, still not looking directly at me, "I want you to know this isn't easy for any of us." I waited for her to say more, to maybe soften the blow with some reassurance that this was temporary or that they'd help me get back on my feet once I proved myself. But she just stood there for a moment, keychain in her hand, looking like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "I know," I said finally, because the silence was becoming unbearable. She nodded and walked toward the door, pausing only to grab her coffee mug from the counter. "There are boxes in the garage," she said without turning around, "for packing." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone in the house that would soon no longer be my home. I looked around the kitchen, at the mismatched chairs around the small table, at the refrigerator covered with family photos and appointment reminders and grocery lists written in my mother's careful handwriting. It all looked the same as it had yesterday, but it felt completely different, like I was seeing it through glass. I spent that first day making phone calls. Marcus could let me crash on his couch for a week, maybe 2 if I helped with groceries and didn't get in the way of his girlfriend's visits. My friend Carlos from high school had a lead on a cheap apartment across town, but I'd need first and last month's rent plus a deposit, money I didn't have and wouldn't have until I picked up more work at the hardware store. By evening, the reality of my situation was starting to sink in. I had about $800 in my checking account, a car that needed new tires, and a family that had apparently been counting down the days until they could show me the door. The photography equipment I'd spent 2 years saving for was worth maybe $1,500 if I sold it, but without it, I'd have no way to book the weddings that might eventually lead to something bigger. I was sitting on my bed, surrounded by empty boxes, and trying to decide what was essential enough to take with me, when I heard the front door open. Voices in the living room, my mother and Isabella, but there were others too. Uncle Roberto, Aunt Carmen, even my cousin Miguel, who I hadn't seen in months. I walked quietly to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, trying to make out what they were saying. The conversation was animated but kept low, like they were trying not to wake someone up. Then I heard my name, and my stomach dropped. "He's been in there all day," Isabella was saying, "barely came out except to make those phone calls." "Good," Uncle Roberto's voice replied. "Maybe he's finally taking this seriously." "I still think we should have given him more time," Aunt Carmen said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "2 weeks is generous," my mother responded, her voice carrying that tone of finality I'd learned to recognize over the years. "He's had 28 years to figure this out. At some point, you have to stop making excuses." I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. They were talking about me like I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be shifted from one set of shoulders to another. Whatever love they'd once had for me had apparently been eroded by years of disappointment and unmet expectations. That night, I started packing in earnest. Clothes, books, the few pieces of furniture that were actually mine. I packed my cameras last, wrapping them carefully in old t-shirts and placing them in their cases like I was preparing them for surgery. They were the most valuable things I owned, but more than that, they were the only things that made me feel like I had something to offer the world. As I worked, I thought about all the family gatherings I'd attended over the years, all the times I'd felt proud to be a Zalamea, connected to this network of people who shared my blood and my history. Now, those memories felt different, tainted by the knowledge that I'd been living on borrowed time, accepted conditionally rather than unconditionally. By the end of the week, most of my belongings were packed in boxes stacked against my bedroom walls. The room looked bare and impersonal, like a hotel room after checkout. I'd found a studio apartment in Tempe that I could barely afford, and Marcus had agreed to help me move my stuff with his truck. The night before I was supposed to leave, my mother knocked on my door. It was the first time she'd initiated a conversation with me since that morning in the kitchen. "Come in," I said, sitting up on my bed. She stepped into the room and looked around at the boxes and bare walls. For a moment, her expression softened, and I thought maybe she was having second thoughts. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and resolved. "I hope you understand that this isn't about not loving you," she said. "This is about loving you enough to let you fail." I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "Let me fail?" "You've never had to face real consequences for your choices," she continued. "Every time things got difficult, you had this house to fall back on, our support to cushion the blow. But real growth, real strength, it only comes from having no choice but to succeed." I wanted to argue with her, to point out that I'd been trying to succeed, that building something worthwhile takes time and often looks like failure from the outside. But I also knew that nothing I said would change her mind. This decision had been made not just by her, but by the whole family, and it was bigger than any conversation we could have in my nearly empty bedroom. "I love you too, Mom," I said finally, "even if I don't understand this." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes but not falling. "Someday you will." The next morning, Marcus showed up with his truck right on schedule. He helped me load my boxes and furniture, making jokes and trying to keep the mood light, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the whole situation. We'd been friends since middle school, and he'd spent enough time at family dinners and birthday parties to know that the Zalameas weren't the kind of people who threw their kids out on the street. As we loaded the last box, my mother and Isabella came out to say goodbye. It was awkward and formal, like we were acquaintances rather than family. My mother hugged me briefly, and Isabella shook my hand like we were sealing a business deal. "Take care of yourself," Isabella said, "and call if you need anything." But we all knew I wouldn't call, not after this. Whatever safety net I'd had was gone now, and calling for help would just prove their point about me being unable to handle things on my own. I climbed into the passenger seat of Marcus's truck and watched my childhood home disappear in the side mirror. The house looked smaller from the street, more ordinary than it had seemed when it was my whole world. In the driveway, my mother and sister stood side by side, watching us drive away. And I wondered if they felt as empty as I did, or if this was just another Thursday morning for them now. The studio apartment in Tempe was exactly as depressing as I'd expected. 400 square feet of beige carpet and fluorescent lighting, with a kitchenette that barely qualified as functional, and a bathroom so small you had to step into the shower to close the door. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned, and that had to count for something. Marcus helped me move my stuff in, then hung around for a beer and some half-hearted conversation about how this was probably going to be good for me in the long run. After he left, I sat on my mattress on the floor, surrounded by boxes I didn't have the energy to unpack, and tried to figure out what came next. The silence in the apartment was different from the silence at home. At home, silence meant everyone was busy or resting, but the house itself was still alive with familiar sounds and smells. Here, silence just meant emptiness, a vacuum where family and belonging used to be. I opened my laptop and scrolled through my email, looking for wedding inquiries or any other photography jobs that might help me make rent. There was one response to an ad I'd posted, a family looking for someone to photograph their daughter's graduation party. The pay was low, but it was something. As I typed my response, I realized that this was it. This was the moment my adult life actually began. Not when I turned 18 or when I graduated high school, but right now. Sitting alone in an apartment I could barely afford, with no one to call if things went wrong. The family that had raised me, fed me, sheltered me for 28 years had decided I was ready to face the world on my own. Whether they were right or wrong, whether this would make me stronger or just break me down, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. There was no going back now. That first month was harder than I'd expected. The isolation hit me worse than the financial stress, though both were significant. I picked up extra shifts at the hardware store, took every photography job I could find, and lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. But the hardest part was the silence where family used to be. No more Sunday dinners with everyone talking over each other and laughing at Uncle Roberto's bad jokes. No more random text messages from Isabella complaining about her boss or asking if I wanted to grab lunch. No more coming home to find my mother watching her telenovelas and getting pulled into whatever dramatic storyline was unfolding that week. I'd expected to be angry, and I was, but underneath the anger was something deeper and more painful. I felt erased, like 28 years of being a Zalamea had been canceled out by their disappointment in who I'd become. It made me question everything I thought I knew about love and family and belonging. But slowly, day by day, I started to build something new. Not the photography empire I'd once dreamed of, but something smaller and more sustainable. I learned to cook actual meals, figured out how to manage my money better, developed routines that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule or approval. And every night, as I fell asleep in my tiny apartment, I told myself that this was temporary. That someday I'd prove them wrong. Show them that their faith in me hadn't been misplaced, just premature. That someday we'd all look back on this time as the necessary push I'd needed to become the man I was supposed to be. I had no way of knowing that someday would come sooner than any of us expected, and in a way that would change everything we thought we knew about family, money, and the random cruelties of fate. But that part of the story was still weeks away, hidden in a lawyer's office in downtown Phoenix, waiting in an envelope that would turn my exile into the best thing that ever happened to me. 3 months into living alone, I discovered that solitude has its own language. It speaks in the hum of a refrigerator at 2 a.m., in the echo of your own footsteps on hardwood floors, in the way your voice sounds different when you're talking to yourself because there's nobody else to hear it. I was becoming fluent in this language, whether I wanted to or not. The photography work had picked up slightly. Word travels fast in Phoenix's wedding circuit, and apparently I had developed a reputation for being reliable and cheap, which in the service industry is sometimes better than being talented and expensive. I wasn't getting the high-end venues or the elaborate ceremonies, but I was booked most weekends, and that steady income meant I could upgrade from ramen noodles to actual groceries. The hardware store had promoted me to assistant manager, which mostly meant I got to deal with angry customers and inventory spreadsheets while making $3 more per hour. It wasn't glamorous work, but Jim, the owner, seemed to appreciate that I showed up on time and didn't steal from the register. In a world where I felt like I'd disappointed everyone who mattered, being dependable at something felt like a small victory. But the silence from my family was deafening. Not a single phone call, text message, or even an accidental social media interaction. It was like I'd been surgically removed from their lives, and the wound had healed over so completely that there wasn't even a scar to mark where I used to be. I found out Isabella was engaged through a mutual friend's Facebook post. Apparently, there had been a whole celebration at the house, the same living room where they'd voted me out of the family. I stared at the photos for longer than I should have, studying the faces of relatives I recognized, looking for some sign that someone had wondered where I was or thought to invite me. But everyone looked happy and complete, like nothing was missing from their perfect family picture. The hurt was physical, an actual ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe sometimes. I'd expected anger or disappointment from them, but I hadn't prepared for complete erasure. It was one thing to be the family disappointment, it was another thing entirely to not be family at all. Work became my refuge. At the hardware store, I threw myself into learning every aspect of the business. I memorized product codes, studied supplier catalogs, reorganized the stockroom with an efficiency that impressed even Jim. When customers came in with complex problems, I became the guy who could figure out solutions, who could recommend the right tools and materials for jobs ranging from simple home repairs to major renovations. Photography was different but equally consuming. I started experimenting with different styles, pushing myself beyond the safe poses and standard shots that paid the bills. I'd drive out to the desert before sunrise, hiking with my equipment to capture the way light moved across the landscape. I photographed abandoned buildings in downtown Phoenix, finding beauty in decay and neglect. I even started a small project documenting the homeless community, spending hours listening to stories of people who'd also been discarded by the systems that were supposed to support them. These weren't the kinds of photos that would book me more weddings, but they were the kinds of photos that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with photography in the first place. Behind the camera, I felt like I had a purpose, like I was documenting something true and important about the world. The loneliness was constant, but I learned to work around it like you learn to work around a bad knee or a chronic headache. I developed routines that filled the empty hours: grocery shopping on Wednesday evenings when the stores were quiet, laundry on Sunday mornings while listening to podcasts, long drives through neighborhoods I'd never explored just to feel like I was going somewhere, even when I wasn't. I made a few acquaintances at work and through photography jobs, but nobody who felt like real friendship. People my age were married or seriously dating, focused on building their own family units. The single people I met were either much younger or much older, in different phases of life that didn't intersect with mine in any meaningful way. Marcus checked in occasionally, usually through text messages that felt obligatory rather than genuine. "How's the new place?" Or "Everything going okay?" I always responded positively, partly because I didn't want to burden him with the reality of how isolated I felt, and partly because I was afraid that if I admitted how hard things were, it would confirm everything my family had said about me being unable to handle adult responsibilities. The worst part wasn't the practical challenges or even the loneliness. The worst part was the constant self-doubt that crept in during quiet moments. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was selfish and immature. Maybe I'd been coasting through life, taking their support for granted while contributing nothing of value in return. Maybe this exile wasn't punishment, but mercy, saving them from having to carry my weight any longer. These thoughts would spiral sometimes, especially late at night when the apartment felt too small and too big at the same time. I'd lie awake replaying every family gathering, every conversation, looking for clues I'd missed about how they really saw me. Had they been planning this for months? Years? Had they discussed my failures at family dinners, comparing notes about my latest disappointments when I wasn't around to hear? But morning always came, and with it the necessity of getting up, showering, going to work, pretending to be a functional adult. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I started to become one. The pretending became less exhausting. The routines became habits. The apartment started to feel like home rather than a temporary shelter. I bought a couch, a real one, instead of the lawn chair I'd been using for the first few months. I hung my photographs on the walls, creating a gallery of my own work that made the space feel more personal. I learned to cook beyond the basics, experimenting with recipes I found online and actually enjoying the process of creating something from raw ingredients. The hardware store job evolved into something more meaningful when Jim started asking for my input on business decisions. He was approaching retirement and seemed genuinely interested in grooming someone to eventually take over operations. It wasn't the creative career I'd imagined for myself, but there was satisfaction in being trusted with responsibility, in knowing that my opinions mattered to someone. Photography remained my passion, but I started approaching it more professionally. I created a proper website, invested in better equipment, and began charging rates that reflected the quality of my work rather than my desperation for any income. The wedding bookings became more selective. I turned down jobs that didn't excite me or that came with clients who seemed like they'd be difficult to work with. One Saturday afternoon in late October, I was photographing a quinceañera in South Phoenix when I overheard some of the older women talking in Spanish near the Cape Cable. They were discussing someone's son who'd started his own business, how proud his mother was, how family support had made all the difference. One of them said something about blood being thicker than water, and how you never give up on family no matter how hard they make it. I kept shooting, but their words stuck with me. That night, driving home through streets that were starting to feel familiar rather than foreign, I found myself thinking about the concept of chosen family versus biological family. The people at the quinceañera had clearly been through hardships together, supported each other through difficult times, celebrated each other's successes. But they'd chosen to do those things. It wasn't obligation or guilt or tradition driving their connections. It was genuine love and respect. Maybe that was what I needed to build. Maybe, instead of mourning the family that had rejected me, I needed to focus on creating the kind of relationships that were based on mutual support rather than shared DNA. The holidays were approaching, and I dreaded them. Thanksgiving had always been a huge production at our house, with extended family traveling from across Arizona to crowd around our dining room table. Christmas was even bigger, with gift exchanges that went late into the night and breakfast traditions that stretched back generations. The thought of spending those days alone in my apartment, pretending they didn't matter, felt unbearable. But then Jim mentioned that he usually spent Thanksgiving volunteering at a local shelter, serving meals to people who didn't have families to go home to. He asked if I wanted to join him, not out of pity, but because they needed photographers to document the event for their fundraising materials. Thanksgiving morning, I showed up at the shelter with my camera and no expectations beyond getting through the day without falling into self-pity. But something unexpected happened. Working alongside other volunteers, serving food to people who were genuinely grateful for a hot meal and human connection, I felt useful in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Between taking photos, I found myself talking to some of the guests. There was an older man named David who'd lost his apartment after a medical bankruptcy but still had an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball statistics. A woman named Rosa who was staying at the shelter temporarily while saving money for her own place, who showed me pictures of the garden she planned to plant when she got settled. A teenager named Alex, who'd aged out of foster care and was working 2 jobs while trying to finish his GED. These weren't people who'd given up or been given on. They were people who'd hit rough patches and were working to rebuild their lives, just like I was. The difference was that they'd found a community at the shelter, people who understood their struggles and supported their efforts to move forward. After the meal service ended, several of the volunteers went out for coffee. I almost declined, falling back into my pattern of isolation, but Jim insisted I join them. For 2 hours, I sat around a table with people who barely knew me, but treated me like I belonged. They shared stories about their work at the shelter, their own families, their plans for the rest of the holiday weekend. Nobody asked probing questions about why I was spending Thanksgiving volunteering instead of with relatives. They just accepted my presence and included me in their conversations. Walking back to my car that evening, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because my problems had been solved or because I'd forgotten about my family, but because I'd remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than my own disappointments. The next week, I signed up to volunteer regularly at the shelter, not just for special events, but for their weekly meal service and job training programs. I started bringing my camera to document their work, creating images that helped them secure grants and donations. The executive director, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, seemed impressed by my commitment and the quality of my photographs. "Have you ever thought about nonprofit work?" she asked one evening as I was packing up my equipment. "We could use someone with your skills in our development department." I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, the idea hadn't occurred to me. All my career fantasies had revolved around building my own photography business, or maybe getting hired by a magazine or wedding planning company. Working for a nonprofit felt like settling, like admitting that I wasn't talented enough for the more glamorous options I'd imagined. But over the next few weeks, as I continued volunteering and learning more about the shelter's programs, I started to see the appeal. The work felt meaningful in a way that photographing wealthy couples' perfect weddings never quite did. There was immediate impact, visible results from efforts to help people improve their circumstances. Christmas came and went. I worked at the hardware store on Christmas Eve, helped serve dinner at the shelter on Christmas Day, and spent the evening in my apartment watching movies and editing photos. It wasn't the family celebration I'd grown up expecting, but it wasn't the lonely ordeal I'd feared either. I was beginning to understand that you could create meaning and tradition without relying on other people's definitions of what holidays should look like. In January, Patricia offered me a part-time position as the shelter's communications coordinator.
The pay wasn't great, but combined with my hardware store income and occasional photography jobs, it would be enough to live on. More importantly, it felt like a chance to use my skills for something that mattered beyond just paying rent. I accepted the job, and for the first time since being kicked out of my family home, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than just away from something. The work was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Writing grant applications, coordinating with local media, developing relationships with potential donors. I had to learn new skills quickly, but I found that I was good at translating the shelter's mission into compelling stories and images. The photography side of the job was particularly rewarding. I started creating portrait series of shelter residents, not as victims or charity cases, but as complex individuals with their own dreams and struggles. David, the baseball fan, was working with a job counselor to find part-time work that would accommodate his health issues. A woman named Rosa, who was staying at the shelter temporarily while saving money for her own place, who showed me pictures of the garden she planned to plant when she got settled. A teenager named Alex, who'd aged out of foster care and was working 2 jobs while trying to finish his GED. These weren't people who'd given up or been given on. They were people who'd hit rough patches and were working to rebuild their lives, just like I was. The difference was that they'd found a community at the shelter, people who understood their struggles and supported their efforts to move forward. After the meal service ended, several of the volunteers went out for coffee. I almost declined, falling back into my pattern of isolation, but Jim insisted I join them. For 2 hours, I sat around a table with people who barely knew me, but treated me like I belonged. They shared stories about their work at the shelter, their own families, their plans for the rest of the holiday weekend. Nobody asked probing questions about why I was spending Thanksgiving volunteering instead of with relatives. They just accepted my presence and included me in their conversations. Walking back to my car that evening, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because my problems had been solved or because I'd forgotten about my family, but because I'd remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than my own disappointments. The next
Rosa had saved enough money to put a deposit down on a small apartment and was planning her garden for spring planting. Alex had passed his GED and was applying to community colleges. These weren't just feel-good stories for the shelter's newsletter. They were reminders that resilience and hope could exist even in the most difficult circumstances. Every time I felt sorry for myself about my family situation, I'd think about the people I was documenting who were rebuilding their lives from much lower starting points. The shelter work also introduced me to other young professionals who were passionate about social justice and community development. For the first time since college, I found myself part of a social group that shared my interests and values. We'd meet for drinks after work, attend art shows and concerts together, volunteer for each other's projects and causes. These relationships felt different from the friendships I'd had before, less based on shared history and more on shared purpose. Nobody knew about my family situation unless I chose to tell them, and when I did share that story, they responded with understanding rather than judgment. Several of them had their own complicated family dynamics, their own stories of choosing independence over dysfunction. By spring, I'd been living alone for almost a year. The anniversary passed without much fanfare, but I marked it privately by looking through the photos I'd taken during my first few months in the apartment. The early shots showed empty walls and cardboard boxes, a space that felt temporary and unwelcoming. The recent photos showed a home, small but comfortable, filled with evidence of a life being actively lived rather than simply endured. The hardware store was doing well enough that Jim had started talking seriously about his retirement plans. He'd mentioned several times that he'd like to sell the business to someone who understood its culture and customer base, someone who wouldn't just strip it for parts or turn it into another corporate chain outlet. The conversations had been casual so far, but I could tell he was testing my interest and taking on more responsibility. At the shelter, my role had expanded beyond communications to include program development and volunteer coordination. Patricia had submitted several of my photo series to local arts organizations, and one had been selected for a group exhibition about homelessness and housing insecurity in Phoenix. It was my first time having my work displayed in a gallery setting, and though the opening reception was small, seeing my photographs on professional walls felt like a milestone. The irony wasn't lost on me that this success was happening precisely because I'd been forced to start over from scratch. Living paycheck to paycheck had made me more creative and resourceful. Working with people facing real hardships had given me perspective on what constituted actual problems versus temporary setbacks. Being cut off from my family's expectations had allowed me to discover what I was genuinely passionate about rather than what I thought I should be passionate about. But there were still moments, usually late at night or early in the morning when my defenses were down, when I missed them terribly. I missed my mother's laugh and Isabella's sharp wit and even Uncle Roberto's terrible jokes. I missed being part of something larger than myself, having people who knew my history and loved me despite my flaws. Social media made it harder to maintain emotional distance. I'd see photos from family gatherings, updates about Isabella's wedding planning, news about cousins starting families or changing jobs. They all looked happy and connected, like they'd seamlessly filled the gap where I used to be. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted how things had ended between us. I never reached out, though. Pride was part of it, but it was more than that. I was afraid that if I contacted them, they'd see my outreach as proof that I couldn't handle independence, that I needed their approval to feel complete. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I was doing well enough on my own, but not well enough to risk their judgment again. The photography business had evolved into something more sustainable and personally satisfying. I still did weddings, but I'd raised my rates enough that I only needed to book 1 or 2 per month to cover my expenses. The rest of my time was devoted to the shelter work and personal projects that fed my creativity rather than just my bank account. One of those projects was a series about small business owners in Phoenix, people who'd built something meaningful from nothing. I photographed mechanics and restaurant owners, artists and landscapers, people who'd taken risks and worked impossible hours to create something that was uniquely theirs. Jim agreed to be one of my subjects, and during our photo session, he opened up about his decision to buy the hardware store 30 years earlier. My family thought I was crazy, he told me as I adjusted my camera settings. Said I should get a safe job with benefits instead of gambling on some rundown store in a neighborhood everybody was writing off. But I could see the potential, I could see what it could become with the right attention and care. He paused while I took a few shots, then continued. Turned out they were wrong about the neighborhood and wrong about the business. But more than that, they were wrong about what makes a person successful. It's not about taking the safest path or making choices other people understand. It's about being willing to work for something you believe in, even when nobody else can see the vision. His words stayed with me as I developed the film and edited the digital images. Looking at the photos of Jim in his store, surrounded by tools and materials that could build or fix almost anything, I saw someone who'd created his own definition of success. He wasn't wealthy in any conventional sense, but he owned something valuable, employed people, served his community, and had built relationships that would outlast any profit margin. That night, I sat in my apartment looking at the photos I'd taken of my other small business subjects. Each one had a story about choosing uncertainty over security, about family members who didn't understand their choices, about building something from scratch with limited resources and unlimited determination. They were all, in their own ways, people who'd been willing to disappoint others in order to remain true to themselves. For the first time since being kicked out, I started to wonder if my family's lack of faith in me said more about them than it did about me. Maybe they were so focused on conventional markers of success that they couldn't recognize other forms of achievement. Maybe their disappointment was less about my failures and more about their limited imagination for what a successful life could look like. The thought was both liberating and sad. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to measure my worth by their standards. Sad because it meant the gap between us might be wider than I'd realized, based on fundamental differences in values rather than simple misunderstandings that could be cleared up with better communication. Summer arrived with its usual brutality, turning Phoenix into a furnace that made any outdoor activity feel like an endurance test. The shelter was busier during these months, as people struggled with the choice between paying for air conditioning or other necessities. My photography work slowed down as couples postponed outdoor ceremonies until the weather cooled, but the nonprofit job kept me busy with fundraising campaigns focused on keeping cooling centers operational.
It was during one of these oppressively hot July days that everything changed. I was at the hardware store helping a contractor figure out the best materials for a roofing repair job when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, but the area code was local, so I answered. "Is this Lorenzo Zalamea?" The voice was professional, formal, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Lorenzo." "Mr. Zalamea, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Blake and Associates. We're a law firm here in Phoenix, and I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding the estate of Eduardo Vasquez. Are you familiar with Mr. Vasquez?" The name meant nothing to me. I told her so, wondering if this was some kind of scam or case of mistaken identity. "That's not uncommon," she said. "Could you come to our office this week? There are some documents you need to review, and this really isn't something we can discuss over the phone." Something in her tone suggested this wasn't optional. I agreed to meet with her the next day during my lunch break, more out of curiosity than any expectation that this Eduardo Vasquez person had any connection to my life. The law office was in one of Phoenix's newer high-rises, all glass and marble and the kind of expensive minimalism that was supposed to communicate success and reliability. Janet Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades delivering difficult news to unprepared people. She led me to a conference room with windows overlooking the downtown area, offered me coffee that I declined, and opened a thick folder that had my name written on the tab. "Mr. Zalamea," she began, "6 weeks ago, Eduardo Vasquez passed away at the age of 84.
According to his will, you are the sole beneficiary of his estate." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline or the catch or the explanation that would make this make sense. "I'm sorry, but there has to be some mistake. I don't know anyone named Eduardo Vasquez." She slid a photograph across the table. It showed an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face, someone who looked vaguely familiar but whom I couldn't place. "Does this help?" she asked. I studied the photo more carefully. There was something about the man's features, the shape of his nose, and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, that reminded me of someone, but I couldn't make the connection. "I'm sorry, but no, I really don't recognize him." Janet Morrison nodded, like she'd expected this response. "Mr. Vasquez left a letter for you, along with the will. Perhaps that will provide some clarity." She handed me an envelope with my name written on it in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Inside was a letter written in Spanish, which I could read well enough, thanks to growing up in a bilingual household. "Querido Lorenzo," it began. "My dear Lorenzo, if you are reading this, then I have passed on, and you are learning about our connection for the first time. I am your great-uncle, the brother of your grandmother Carmen Vasquez Zalamea. We lost touch with your family many years ago, but I never stopped following your lives from a distance." My hands started shaking as I read. My grandmother Carmen had died when I was 10 years old, and I remembered her talking about family members who'd scattered across the Southwest during hard economic times, but she'd never mentioned a brother named Eduardo. The letter continued. "I know this must be confusing for you. I made the decision many years ago to stay away from the family because of disagreements that seemed important then but feel foolish now. I built a life here in Phoenix, never married, never had children of my own, but I always planned to reconnect someday, to heal the wounds that pride and stubbornness had created." I looked up at Janet Morrison, who was watching me with professional patience. "This is really happening?" I asked. "I'm afraid so. Would you like me to continue with the details of the estate?" I nodded, though I felt like I was dreaming or hallucinating from the heat. Mr. Vasquez owned significant real estate holdings in Phoenix and Tucson, as well as investment accounts and a successful restaurant chain that he built over 40 years. The total value of the estate is approximately $80 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the conference room walls. $80 million? Yes. There are some taxes and fees to be handled, but the vast majority of that will pass to you once probate is complete. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city where I'd been struggling to pay rent on a 400-square-foot apartment. Somewhere down there was my family, the people who'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble of loving, who'd cut me out of their lives because they thought I'd never amount to anything. "Why me?" I asked, still staring out the window. Why not my mother or my sister or any of the other family members? Janet Morrison consulted her notes. According to his letter and the documents he left, Mr. Vasquez had been keeping track of your family for years. He knew about your parents' divorce, your sister's career, your struggles to find your path. He felt that you were the one who most needed this opportunity and the one most likely to use it wisely. I sat back down and read the rest of the letter. Eduardo wrote about watching my photography work online, about reading articles about the shelter where I volunteered, about being proud of the man I was becoming despite the challenges I'd faced. He wrote about regret, about wishing he'd reached out sooner, about hoping this inheritance would give me the freedom to live the life I was meant to live. "There's one condition," Janet Morrison said as I finished reading. "Mr. Vasquez requested that you not share news of this inheritance with your immediate family for at least 6 months. He felt that money has a way of changing relationships, and he wanted you to have time to adjust to your new circumstances before dealing with other people's reactions." I thought about my mother and Isabella, about Uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen, and all the relatives who'd watched me get thrown out of the family without saying a word. 6 months felt like both too long and not nearly long enough. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we begin the probate process. It will take several weeks to finalize everything, but I can arrange for you to have access to some funds immediately if you need them. There are also properties and business interests that will require your attention once the estate is settled." I walked out of that law office in a daze, $80 million richer on paper, but feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The heat that had seemed oppressive an hour earlier barely registered as I made my way back to the hardware store. Jim took one look at me and sent me home early, probably thinking I was suffering from heat stroke. That night, I sat in my apartment with Eduardo's letter in my hands, reading it over and over again. This man I'd never met had been watching my life, rooting for me, believing in me when my own family had given up. He'd built a fortune over decades of hard work and careful planning, and he'd decided that I deserved to inherit it all. The irony was almost too much to process. The family who'd thrown me out for being worthless had no idea that I was about to become wealthier than any of them could imagine. The great-uncle they'd apparently forgotten or dismissed had been quietly building an empire that would now be mine to manage. But more than the money, what struck me was Eduardo's faith in me. He'd seen something in my struggles, my volunteer work, my artistic pursuits that my immediate family had missed entirely. He'd looked at my unconventional path and seen potential rather than failure. As I fell asleep that night, I couldn't help but think about what my mother would say when she found out, what Isabella would think when she realized the brother she'd written off as hopeless was now worth more money than she'd see in 10 lifetimes. What Uncle Roberto would do when he discovered that his jokes about my lack of ambition had aged very poorly indeed. But those conversations were still months away, protected by Eduardo's wise request for secrecy. For now, I had time to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be with this unexpected fortune, what kind of life I wanted to build with resources I'd never dreamed of having. The family who'd rejected me was about to learn that sometimes the people you throw away are the ones who turn out to be worth the most. But first, I had to figure out what that actually meant. The first thing I bought with my inheritance wasn't a car or a house or anything flashy. It was time. I walked into the hardware store the next morning and gave Jim my 2 weeks' notice. Not because I didn't appreciate everything he'd taught me, but because I finally had the luxury of choosing what to do with my days instead of just surviving them. "You sure about this?" Jim asked, looking genuinely concerned. "That nonprofit job isn't going to pay you enough to live on long term." I smiled and told him I'd figured out a way to make it work, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He offered to match whatever the shelter was paying me, and when I declined, he made me promise to come back if things didn't work out. Good people are rare in this world, and Jim was definitely one of them. At the shelter, Patricia was thrilled when I asked about going full-time. The organization had been trying to expand their programs for years, but they'd never had the funding or staff to make it happen. With my inheritance providing financial security, I could afford to work for passion instead of just a paycheck. But I didn't tell her about the money either. Eduardo's request for secrecy had become more than just a legal requirement. It had become a protective barrier that let me figure out who I was becoming without external pressure or expectations. For 6 months, I got to live like a person with unlimited resources while appearing to everyone else like the same struggling nonprofit worker I'd always been. The changes were subtle at first. I upgraded my photography equipment, but gradually, so it looked like I was just reinvesting profits from wedding jobs. I moved to a better apartment, but nothing too fancy, nothing that would raise questions about where the money was coming from. I started eating at nicer restaurants occasionally, buying clothes that actually fit properly, getting my car serviced regularly instead of waiting for things to break. More importantly, I started thinking differently about the future. Instead of just trying to get by day to day, I could make long-term plans, take calculated risks, invest in ideas that might not pay off immediately but could create lasting impact. The shelter had always operated on a shoestring budget, turning away people they could have helped if they'd had more resources. Now I could quietly ensure they'd never have to make those choices again. I set up a foundation in Eduardo's name, funneling money through it to support not just the shelter, but other organizations working on homelessness, job training, and community development throughout Phoenix. Nobody knew the donations were coming from me. As far as anyone could tell, this mysterious Eduardo Vasquez Foundation had appeared out of nowhere with deep pockets and a commitment to social justice. The irony of using my inheritance to help people my family would probably consider undeserving wasn't lost on me. My mother had always been generous with church donations and family members in need, but she'd never shown much sympathy for people whose problems seemed to stem from poor decisions or lack of motivation. She would have been baffled by my choice to spend Eduardo's money on homeless shelters and job training programs instead of investing it for my own security. But that was exactly why Eduardo had chosen me instead of her. He'd seen something in my values, my willingness to work with people others had written off, that aligned with his own beliefs about what money should be used for. The inheritance wasn't just about making my life easier, it was about continuing his legacy of building something meaningful. As the 6-month mark approached, I started preparing for the conversation I'd been dreading. Not just telling my family about the money, but deciding whether I wanted them back in my life at all. The inheritance had given me options I'd never had before, including the option to walk away from them permanently. But Eduardo's letter had included something I hadn't shared with anyone, not even the lawyer. In his final paragraph, he'd written about forgiveness, about how carrying anger toward family members who disappointed him had cost him decades of relationships he could never get back. He'd urged me not to make the same mistake, to remember that people can change and grow if given the chance. Easy advice to give, harder advice to follow. Sitting in my new apartment, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built without them, I wasn't sure I wanted to risk letting them back in. They'd shown me exactly how conditional their love was, and money had a way of making people's motivations even more complicated. The decision was made for me on a Tuesday afternoon in late January. I was leaving the shelter after a board meeting when I saw a familiar car in the parking lot. Isabella's white Honda Civic, with the small dent in the rear bumper from when she'd backed into our mailbox 3 years earlier. She was sitting inside, engine running, talking on her phone. When she saw me walking toward my car, she ended her call and got out. For a moment, we just stood there in the afternoon sun, siblings who'd become strangers, trying to figure out how to navigate this unexpected encounter. "Lorenzo," she said finally, "I wasn't sure it was really you." "It's me," I replied, noting how different she looked. Thinner, more serious, wearing the kind of business attire that suggested her banking career was going well. "What are you doing here?" She gestured toward the shelter building. "I volunteer here sometimes, financial literacy workshops. I had no idea you worked here." The awkwardness was suffocating, but there was something else too. Relief, maybe, that the silence between us had finally been broken, even if neither of us had planned it. "How long have you been volunteering here?" I asked. "About 4 months. Patricia mentioned they had a photographer who did amazing work documenting their programs, but she never told me your name." Isabella smiled slightly. "Though I should have guessed. You always were the one with the camera." We stood there for another moment, and I could see her working up to something, gathering courage for whatever she'd really come to say.
Lorenzo, I need to tell you something about about what happened. She looked down at her hands. It wasn't just about the money or thinking you were irresponsible. It was about fear. Fear of what? Fear that if we kept enabling you, you'd never figure out what you were really capable of. But also fear that maybe you already knew what you were capable of and we just couldn't see it. She met my eyes. Mama's been worried sick about you. We all have. I wanted to laugh or cry or maybe both. Worried enough to pick up the phone? We didn't think you'd want to hear from us. We thought, she trailed off, we thought we'd done something unforgivable. Standing there in the parking lot, I realized this was the moment Eduardo had been preparing me for. The choice between holding on to justified anger or taking a risk on the possibility that people could learn and change. The inheritance had given me the power to either punish them or free them, and my decision would say as much about who I'd become as it did about who they were. Isabella, I said quietly, there's something I need to tell you, something that's going to change everything.
3 hours later, we were sitting in a coffee shop downtown, and I'd told her everything. About Eduardo, about the inheritance, about the 6 months I'd spent learning how to be wealthy while pretending to be poor. She'd listened without interrupting, her expressions cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been pride. $80 million, she repeated for the third time, and you've been working at a homeless shelter and living in a regular apartment. It seemed important to figure out who I was with the money before I let it change how other people saw me. She was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup like it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "We were so wrong about you," she said finally. "We thought you needed us to push you to succeed, but you were already succeeding in ways we couldn't recognize." "Maybe you weren't entirely wrong," I admitted. "Maybe I did need to be pushed out of the nest, but the way you did it, it felt like you were giving up on me instead of giving me space to grow." Isabella nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Mama's going to want to see you. When she finds out about this, about everything you've accomplished, she's going to be so proud and so ashamed at the same time. What about Uncle Roberto, Aunt Carmen, all the relatives who watched me get kicked out without saying a word?" "They're going to have to live with that," Isabella said firmly. "But Lorenzo, if you can find it in yourself to forgive us, to give us another chance, I promise we'll do better. We'll be the family you deserved all along." That evening, I drove to the house where I'd grown up, the house I'd been thrown out of 18 months earlier. It looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. The paint was peeling on the front porch, and the lawn needed attention. With my inheritance, I could buy this house and 10 others just like it without making a dent in my wealth. My mother answered the door, and for a moment, she looked like she was seeing a ghost. Then her face crumpled, and she was hugging me and crying and apologizing all at once. "Mijo," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. We were so stupid, so blind." Over dinner, I told the story again. This time, my mother listened with a mixture of amazement and regret that was painful to watch. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "Your great-uncle Eduardo," she said slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about her brother who went to Phoenix and became successful in restaurants. But that was so long ago, we thought he died years ago. He kept track of all of you. He knew about Isabella's engagement, about your job at the clinic, about everything." My mother covered her face with her hands. "And he chose you because we threw you away, because we were too proud and too stupid to see what he could see." The conversation went late into the night. There were tears and apologies and tentative plans for rebuilding relationships that had been damaged but not destroyed. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Trust takes time to rebuild, and some wounds leave permanent scars. But it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, word spread through the extended family about my inheritance. The reactions were exactly what I'd expected: shock, guilt, and in some cases, sudden renewed interest in maintaining family connections. Uncle Roberto called to congratulate me and suggest we get together soon to discuss investment opportunities. Aunt Carmen sent a card expressing regret about how things had been handled and hoped that we could move forward as a family. But I'd learned something important during my months of secret wealth. Money reveals who people really are, but it doesn't change who they are. The relatives who'd been genuinely sorry for their behavior before they knew about the inheritance were the ones whose apologies I could accept. The ones who only reached out after hearing about the money were the ones I kept at arm's length. Isabella and I started meeting regularly for lunch, rebuilding our relationship slowly and carefully. My mother and I talked on the phone every few days, sharing the kinds of mundane details about our daily lives that families take for granted until they're gone. It wasn't the same as before. We were all different people now, shaped by the experience of loss and separation. But it was real, in a way our old relationships had never been. The inheritance allowed me to expand my work at the shelter exponentially. We opened 2 new locations, hired additional staff, created programs that addressed not just immediate needs, but long-term solutions. Patricia promoted me to executive director, and I started speaking at conferences about innovative approaches to homelessness and community development. I also bought a house, a modest place in Central Phoenix, with a studio for my photography work and enough space to host family dinners. The first one was awkward, everyone trying too hard to prove that things were back to normal. But by the 3rd or 4th gathering, we'd settled into new rhythms that acknowledged both our history and our growth. Eduardo's portrait hangs in my living room now, next to photos of the shelter residents and family pictures from recent gatherings. He never got to meet me in person, but his faith in my potential had changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me. The inheritance was generous, but the greater gift was his belief that I was worthy of such generosity. 6 months after revealing the inheritance to my family, I received a letter from Janet Morrison. The final legal details had been resolved, and the estate was now completely under my control. Attached was a note Eduardo had left for me to receive after everything was settled, one last message from beyond the grave. Lorenzo, it read, if you are reading this, then you have successfully navigated the challenges of sudden wealth while remaining true to the values that made me choose you. I hope the money has brought you happiness, but more than that, I hope it has brought you the freedom to live according to your principles. Use it well, share it generously, and remember that the best inheritance you can leave is not money, but the example of a life lived with purpose and compassion. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the photos of Eduardo's restaurants and the business records that showed how he'd built his empire through decades of hard work and careful planning. He'd given me more than money. He'd given me a model for how to be successful without losing sight of what truly mattered. The family who'd once thrown me out for being worthless now bragged about their son and brother who ran a major nonprofit and owned properties throughout Arizona. It would have been easy to feel bitter about their change in attitude, to point out the hypocrisy in their sudden pride. But Eduardo's example had taught me that holding on to anger was a luxury I couldn't afford, not because I lacked the money to maintain it, but because I lacked the time. Life is short, wealth is temporary, but the impact we have on other people's lives can echo forward for generations. Eduardo had understood this, and through his inheritance, he'd given me the resources to understand it too. The family who'd rejected me had inadvertently set me free to become the person I was meant to be, and for that, I was grateful to all of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.